In the ancient Sanskrit epic, The Great Legacy, we encounter the Brahmastra, a weapon that defies the primitive classification of sword or spear. It is depicted not as a piece of forged steel, but as a singular, luminous projectile manifested from a humble blade of grass, yet pulsing with the raw, volatile power of the cosmos itself. Upon impact, the Brahmastra is said to summon a towering pillar of incandescent smoke and searing flame, rivaling the collective brilliance of 10,000 suns rising in unison. The resulting cataclysm is described in harrowing detail. Entire legions vaporized, rivers brought to a violent boil, and the very soil rendered toxic, leaving the land barren, scorched, and devoid of life for generations to come. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as the poetic hyperbole of ancient bards. Yet, in our modern era, as we read these chilling descriptions, the blinding flash, the mushrooming cloud, the lingering sickness of the earth, an unsettling primal dread takes hold. Was this truly the flight of a Bronze Age imagination, or is it a haunting, fractured memory of a forgotten catastrophe? Could it be that an ancient civilization possessed a mastery of the fundamental forces of the universe that we are only now beginning to uncover? This is but one of the countless enigmas woven into the grand, intricate tapestry of the Great Legacy. A narrative that functions simultaneously as mythology, historical chronicle, spiritual compass, and a profound examination of the human condition. We shall navigate these depths together. I am truly grateful for your presence. As you settle in, I hope to offer you peace, rest, and perhaps a flicker of historical inspiration. If you find this journey meaningful, consider supporting the channel with a like or a subscription, though your enjoyment remains the only true priority. Please share where in the world you are listening from and what the hour is for you. It is a comfort to know where our community gathers as the shadows lengthen. And now, let us begin our journey to an age of gods and kings on the vast plains of ancient Hastinapura. Our story commences in a kingdom that feels as though it were carved from the bones of the earth itself, nestled along the fertile, life-giving banks of the sacred river Sovereign. This was the seat of the Sterling Dynasty, the city of Sterlington, a sprawling marvel of gleaming white palaces, rhythmic bazaars, and golden-domed temples. At its zenith stood King Senator Stenton, a man as righteous as he was powerful, commanding the absolute devotion of his subjects. His reign was a golden epoch, characterized by enduring peace and overflowing granaries, a state of serene contentment that felt as though it might stretch into eternity. But the currents of fate are as treacherous and unpredictable as the river that cradled his kingdom. One day, while hunting along the riverbank, the king's gaze fell upon a woman of such ethereal grace that the world seemed to hold its breath. She stood at the water's edge, luminous and otherworldly, appearing less like a creature of flesh and blood and more like the living embodiment of the river's currents. Senator Stenton, a man accustomed to command, felt a yearning so absolute it became a physical ache within his soul. He approached her with the humility of a devotee, and with all the elegance a king could summon, he offered her his heart and his crown. The woman, who identified herself only as River Sovereign, agreed, but her acceptance was tethered to a chilling, absolute condition. "I shall be your queen," she declared, her voice like the shifting of tides, "but you must never, under any circumstances, question my actions. You must never inquire into my origins, nor stand in my way, regardless of what I choose to do. The moment a single word of protest passes your lips, I shall vanish from your life forever." Blinded by his infatuation, Senator Stenton saw this not as a warning, but as a meager price for an eternity with such a divine presence. He pledged his oath without hesitation, and together they returned to the palace. For a time, the kingdom knew a happiness that bordered on the divine. But when a son was born to them, a beautiful, healthy prince, Stenton's bliss was shattered. He watched in frozen horror as his queen, his beloved River Sovereign, walked with a haunting, rhythmic grace to the river and released their newborn into the churning depths. It was a silent, ritualistic drowning. The king's heart screamed, a jagged cry of grief caught in his throat. Yet he remembered his vow. The terror of losing her outweighed his paternal agony, and he remained silent. One by one, 7 sons were born to the House of Sterling, and 7 times Senator Stenton watched his queen surrender their flesh and blood to a watery grave. The silence he maintained became a slow-acting poison, hollowing him out until he was but a ghost haunting his own court, perpetually haunted by the faces of the children he had failed to save. When the 8th son arrived, the king's spirit finally fractured. As River Sovereign approached the riverbank with the infant in her arms, Stenton rushed forward, barring her path with a voice cracked by 7 years of suppressed anguish. "Stop! Who are you, you monster? How can a mother commit such an atrocity against her own children?" The queen stopped. The serene, distant mask she wore melted into an expression of profound, crushing sorrow. "I am the river goddess," she whispered, "and our sons were the 7 sentinels, celestial beings cursed by a sage to endure the suffering of mortal life. By casting them back into the water, I granted them mercy, liberating their souls from their terrestrial prisons the moment they arrived." She looked at the child in her arms with a tearful gaze. "This 8th son, however, is cursed to live a long and arduous existence. Because you have broken your vow, I must leave you. But I shall take this child to the celestial realms, where he will be honed by the greatest masters of the universe, and one day I will return him to you." With a shimmering flash of light, she and the infant vanished, leaving Stenton a broken man presiding over an airless, empty kingdom. Years passed, and the aging king returned to the riverbank of his greatest sorrow. There, he witnessed a miracle. A young man, radiant with power, held back the entire, surging flow of the mighty River Sovereign with a singular barrage of perfectly aimed arrows. As the king watched, spellbound, the river goddess emerged from the waters, presenting the youth, Donovan Sterling, to his father. He was a master of statecraft, scripture, and the art of war, taught by gods and sages alike. The joy that flooded Stenton's heart washed away the grief of decades, and he returned with his heir to Stirlington. It is here that history and legend collide. Archaeological excavations at the site believed to be the ancient Hastinapura have unearthed evidence of a catastrophic flood layer dating to approximately 800 BCE. A brutal event that mirrors the epic's account of the city's near destruction by the River Sovereign, lending a tantalizing, if tragic, fragment of reality to this mythic place. Yet peace was but a fleeting guest. On a later hunting trip, the king was captivated by a new scent, a fragrance so divine it led him to Satyavati, the daughter of a humble ferryman. Once again, Stenton was ensnared by love, but the ferryman demanded a cruel price. Only the sons born to Satyavati would inherit the throne of Hastinapura. Stenton was aghast. How could he betray Donovan, his perfect, God-taught son? He returned to the palace in a shroud of silent melancholy. When Donovan discovered the cause of his father's distress, the noble prince approached the ferryman himself and made the ultimate sacrifice. He renounced his right to the throne. The ferryman, sensing an opportunity for even greater control, pointed out that Donovan's future heirs could still challenge the line of succession. In that heartbeat, Donovan made a second, more profound vow. He swore an oath of lifelong celibacy, ensuring that he would never produce a successor to contest the throne. As he spoke, the heavens seemed to tremble. Gods and sages rained flowers from the sky, whispering his new name, Bhishma, the one of the terrible vow. Stenton granted his son the boon of choosing the hour of his own death, but it was a cold comfort. The father had his bride, but the son had shackled his own future, a sacrifice that would, in the fullness of time, bring the Sterling Dynasty to the very precipice of annihilation. Physical traits and congenital anomalies were never dismissed as the random whims of biology in the kingdom of Hastinapura. They were interpreted as cosmic omens, visible signatures etched upon the mortal coil, revealing the hidden topography of the soul. Zoroaster's blindness was whispered to be the physical echo of his mother's willful blindness to the dark impulses of her own heart. Similarly, Paul Sterling's pallor, a peculiar, haunting pallor, was the exterior manifest of Ambalika's enduring terror. This pervasive belief suggested a destiny forged in the metaphysical realm and stamped upon the skin at the very instant of creation. With his penance completed, the ascetic Vance Parker retreated into the shadows of the wilderness, leaving the palace of Hastinapura to grapple with 3 children of strange and miraculous origin. They were placed under the watchful, if weary, stewardship of Bill Sterling. Zoroaster, the firstborn, matured into a man of terrifying physical power, yet his sightless eyes fostered a jagged insecurity. He harbored an insatiable, corrosive hunger for a throne he could sense beneath his fingertips but never truly behold. Paul Sterling, though lacking his brother's brute mass, possessed a razor-sharp intellect and a spirit forged in the fires of nobility, while the third, Vidora, emerged as a polymath whose wisdom eclipsed the stagnant minds of his royal peers. When the mantle of leadership demanded a successor, Bill Sterling and the court elders bypassed the sightless Zoroaster, crowning Paul Sterling the ruler of the Kurus. Under Bill's orchestration, alliances were solidified through marriage. Zoroaster was wed to Gwen Sterling, a princess whose devotion bordered on the fanatical. She chose to blindfold herself for the remainder of her days, choosing to traverse the world in her husband's eternal night. Paul Sterling took 2 wives, Constance and Madeline, yet his reign would soon be fractured by a lethal irony. During a hunt, he mistakenly slew a sage disguised as a mating deer. As the sage drew his final breath, he unleashed a curse. The moment Paul Sterling attempted intimacy with his wives, death would claim him instantly. Broken and stripped of the hope of a natural heir, Paul abdicated and sought refuge in the Himalayan heights. It was amidst the silent peaks that the next generation was conceived. Constance, revealing a long-guarded secret, invoked a mantra granted to her in girlhood, a divine summons that allowed her to call upon the gods themselves to father her children. With Paul's blessing, she summoned Dharma, the god of justice, and birthed Justin Sterling. She called upon the wind god, Vu, who sired the monolithic Benjamin Sterling. Finally, she invoked Indra, the king of heaven, to bring forth Arthur Sterling, a prodigy of the bow. Constance shared the sacred mantra with Madeline, who invoked the Ashins, the divine horsemen, resulting in the birth of the twins Nicholas and Samuel. These 5 children were the Pandava brothers, born of starlight and celestial nectar. When word of their arrival reached the palace, Gwen Sterling, then enduring a pregnancy that had defied the laws of nature for an agonizingly long time, succumbed to a madness born of jealousy. In a fit of desperate rage, she struck her own womb. She did not birth a child, but a cold, calcified mass of flesh. Just as the executioners moved to discard the abomination, Vance Parker reappeared. He commanded the mass be divided into 101 fragments and sealed within pots of clarified butter. After 2 years of incubation, the vessels were unsealed. From them emerged 100 sons and a single daughter. The first to emerge was Donovan Sterling. His opening cry, the guttural, jagged baying of a jackal, sent a chill through the assembly. The court advisors begged the king to cast the infant into the dark, but the blind king's love was a blindfold of his own making. Thus, the 100 Kawerva brothers were brought into the world, not through the sanctity of a womb, but through a perverse, alchemical experiment. The stage was set. 2 clans, one sired by the divine and the other born of an unnatural earthen process, were now destined to tear the kingdom asunder. For a time, the Himalayan retreat remained an oasis of peace. The Pandavas grew up bathed in the dappled sunlight of mountain forests, sheltered from the serpentine intrigues of Hastinapura. Paul Sterling served as both father and mentor, teaching them the subtle rhythm of the woods and the heavy burden of a king's duty. But the curse remained a dormant viper. One spring morning, when the air hung heavy with the intoxicating scent of jasmine, The king was overwhelmed by a sudden, violent surge of desire for Madeline. He embraced her, and the sage's prophecy uncoiled. He fell dead, his life extinguished in the heartbeat of his transgression. Madeline, consumed by a grief that burned like molten iron, refused to survive him. Believing herself the architect of his demise, she entrusted her twins to Constance and joined her husband on his funeral pyre. The idol was shattered. The Pandavas were orphans, cast into the care of a broken-hearted Constance. Accompanied by a caravan of forest hermits, Constance led her sons down from the clouds to the gates of Hastinapura. Their return caused a seismic shock in the royal court. They were the returned heirs of the beloved Paul, yet their divine claims were met with a mixture of awe and sharp-edged suspicion. Zoroaster welcomed his nephews with a mask of outward affection, but his son, Donovan, felt only the cold sting of displacement. He had spent his life convinced he was the rightful son of the Kuru dynasty. Now he was forced to stand in the shadow of 5 cousins who possessed an uncanny, almost ethereal quality. Among them, Justin Sterling, as the son of the former king, held a claim that cut closer to the bone of legitimacy than any royal decree. In the envious heart of Donovan, these cousins were not family. They were the architects of his obsolescence. The divide between the cousins became an unbridgeable chasm. Justin was the embodiment of tempered righteousness, deliberate and calm. Arthur was a warrior of aesthetic focus, possessed of a natural grace that made him a prodigy in every discipline. Yet it was Benjamin, the second brother, who became the primary target of Donovan's hate. Benjamin was a titan of appetite and strength. He treated the palace as his personal playground, delighting in terrorizing the 100 Kawerva cousins. He would pluck them from trees like overripe fruit, or hold them submerged in the river until their breath turned to bubbles, all while laughing a booming, joyous sound that Donovan interpreted as a death knell to his pride. To Benjamin, it was a sport. To Donovan, every prank was a ritual humiliation that fueled a darker, more murderous design. It was in this environment of escalating friction that Drona, a dark-skinned, iron-willed Brahmin, arrived to sharpen their talents into the lethal instruments of war. His introduction was legendary. When a royal ball fell into a deep well, the princes stood helpless until Drona, with a flick of his wrist and a whispered mantra, turned blades of grass into a retrieval chain of terrifying precision. Drona was installed as the master of the academy, but he brought his own scars. He had been humiliated by a childhood friend, David Providence, who now sat upon a throne and refused him aid. Drona accepted the role of tutor only on the condition of a final payment, the Guru Dakshina. When their training concluded, his students were to march upon Providence and bring David to him in chains. The academy was a crucible. Drona's bias toward Arthur Sterling was blatant. He saw in the third Pandava a mirror of his own obsessive dedication. During the famous trial of the wooden bird, while the other princes babbled about the tree and the leaves, only Arthur fixed his gaze on the target. "I see only the eye of the bird," Arthur declared. Drona's pride in Arthur was the final drop that caused Donovan's sanity to overflow into hatred. He resolved to purge the forest of his cousin, Benjamin. He organized a grand feast along the banks of the River Sovereign, a veneer of hospitality draped over a pit of malice. Donovan personally served Benjamin a bowl of rice pudding, laced with the virulent Kalakuta poison. The unsuspecting Benjamin gorged himself, then collapsed, drifting into an unholy stupor. Donovan and his brothers bound the unconscious giant with creepers and cast his body into the churning dark of the river, convinced they had erased their problem. But the river, which had claimed others, spared the son of Paul Sterling. Benjamin sank into the abyssal depths, landing in the submerged kingdom of the Nagas, the serpent people. The venom of the serpents, meant to kill, acted as a counteragent to the Kalakuta, purging the poison from his veins. The Naga king, recognizing a distant blood connection through the lineage of Constance, gifted Benjamin an elixir granting him the strength of 10,000 elephants. Benjamin consumed 8 pots of the liquid and fell into a catatonic healing slumber. When he finally rose from the river, he was a force of nature, physically redefined. His return to the palace shattered Donovan's composure, though they kept their suspicions silent. The war was no longer fought in the playground. It was being written in the ink of attempted homicide. The education of the princes reached its zenith, and Drona demanded his price. He ordered the princes to march on Providence. The Kawerva brothers, led by an arrogant Donovan, charged the gates like a rabble, only to be humiliated by the disciplined Providence army. Then the Pandavas moved. Arthur led them with the lethal elegance of a dancer, shattering the defenses and dragging King David before Drona. The master savored his revenge, forcibly partitioning the kingdom and reducing his former friend to a humiliated vassal. But the victory was a hollow one. It merely planted the seeds of a deeper vendetta. A grand tournament was arranged in the capital to showcase the prince's martial supremacy. The city was a sea of spectators, all waiting to witness the rise of the next generation of leadership. The atmosphere was brittle with political tension. The duel between Donovan and Benjamin turned from a demonstration into a brawl of primitive, murderous intent, forcing Drona to physically intervene to prevent a fratricidal ending. The finale was reserved for Arthur. He transformed the arena into a landscape of myth, summoning fire and water, mountain and sky, with his divine weapons. The crowd was spellbound. He was not merely a prince, he was a living legend. Then, just as the day seemed decided, a thunderclap shook the arena. A figure strode onto the field, clad in golden armor that seemed fused to his flesh. He moved with the effortless arrogance of the sun itself. He was Kaine. With a voice that cut through the silence, he challenged Arthur's supremacy, replicating his feats with terrifying ease. He challenged Arthur to a duel to the death. The masters hesitated, citing protocol. A duel could only occur between equals. They demanded to know Kaine's lineage. Kaine, the charioteer's son, stood silent. His shame was his shroud. He was of the lowest caste, forbidden from crossing swords with royalty. In that moment of public execution, Donovan Sterling saw his savior. He strode forward, performed a makeshift coronation, and proclaimed Kaine the king of Onga. In a heartbeat, the charioteer's son was a king, forever bound to Donovan by a debt of loyalty that would eventually write the history of the world in blood. High above, Constance Sterling watched in a trance of frozen horror. She recognized the golden armor, the divine earrings. She knew her own blood when she saw it. Her firstborn, the child she had cast into the river to hide her sin, now stood as the champion of her son's mortal enemy. She fainted, a silent scream dying in her throat. The sun set on the tournament, leaving behind a kingdom polarized. The commoners whispered in the markets that Justin was the rightful heir, but the king's heart remained a fortress guarded by his love for the poisonous Donovan. The era of innocence was dead, and the era of the great, inevitable war had arrived. Aided by the venomous whispers of his new champion, Karna, and the serpentine counsel of his maternal uncle, Shane Sterling, Donovan saw the Pandavas' soaring popularity as an existential threat. They could not be allowed to win the hearts of the people. They had to be removed from the board entirely. Late one night, Donovan Sterling stormed into his father's chambers, his composure shattered by a hysteria that bordered on madness. He poured out his insecurities, weaving a tapestry of deceit in which the Pandavas were portrayed as wolves in sheep's clothing, power-hungry usurpers who would surely cast him and his 99 brothers into the abyss of poverty and exile. Shane Sterling, a virtuoso of psychological manipulation, hovered in the shadows, adding his own subtle poisons to the discourse, framing the Pandavas' natural leadership as a direct assault on the rightful inheritance of the king's own kin. Together, they engineered a lethal stratagem. It would not be an open act of aggression, which would undoubtedly ignite the populace into rebellion, but a refined, temporary exile. They would suggest that Constance Sterling and her sons depart for the remote, idyllic city of Valmont, ostensibly to attend a grand festival dedicated to the god, the architect. It was a trap cloaked in the finery of a diplomatic mission, a vacation designed to distance the princes from the capital, stripping them of public protection and leaving the path clear for Donovan to consolidate his grip on the throne. Dhritarashtra, weak-willed and blinded by his indulgent love for his eldest son, finally relented. He summoned Justin Sterling, his voice thick with a performative, syrupy enthusiasm as he extolled the virtues of the Valley View region, the sanctity of its temples, the devotion of its people, and the impending grandeur of the festival. He framed the journey as a sacred honor, a chance for the Sterling house to be represented by its finest. Yudhishthir listened, his serene expression a porcelain mask concealing the cold, encroaching dread seizing his chest. He was no fool. The king's praise was too lavish, the timing too convenient. He felt the silken threads of a conspiracy tightening around his neck. Yet, to refuse was to commit an act of open defiance, handing Donovan the very pretext he needed to brand them as traitors and initiate a war. Trapped by his unwavering devotion to duty and his reverence for his elders, Yudhishthir saw only one path. He gracefully accepted the honor, knowing full well he was walking his family into an expertly constructed slaughterhouse. As they prepared to depart, their uncle, the venerable Prime Minister Victor Vance, pulled Yudhishthir aside. Vance understood the full, jagged extent of Donovan's malice, yet he was paralyzed by his position. Any direct accusation would be dismissed by the king and serve only as a death warrant for himself. He resorted to subterfuge, adopting the guttural, rhythmic dialect of the border tribes, a secret code he had taught the princes in their youth. He spoke in cryptic metaphors, his words painting a chilling prophecy. A weapon forged not of steel can still sever the thread of life, Vance whispered, his eyes searching the shadows. The fire that devours a forest cannot reach the creature that hides deep within the earth. Know the stars to navigate the darkness, and be ever vigilant, especially when the air tastes of smoke. A friend will come to you, one who knows how to pierce the foundations of the world. The warning, though veiled, was terrifyingly clear. An inferno was being prepared, but Vance had already set the gears of salvation in motion. Meanwhile, Donovan's chief sycophant, an architect named Purakana, had been dispatched to Valmont with a singular, monstrous directive. He was to construct a guest palace of unparalleled beauty, a residence of comfort and stunning aesthetic, but one engineered for death. Its walls were a devil's mixture, a volatile blend of lac, hemp, hay, and resin. Its foundations were laced with jute fibers soaked in gallons of clarified ghee. Every beam, every floorboard, and every intricate carving was composed of the most flammable materials known to man, cleverly concealed beneath a thin, deceptive veneer of clay and plaster. It was, in effect, a beautifully furnished, artistically rendered tinderbox. The heavy use of lac, a resinous secretion used for dyes and varnishes, was a particularly insidious touch. Its sharp, chemical scent would be expected in such a lavish structure, masking the true, lethal nature of the architecture. The palace was not a home. It was a bomb, waiting for a spark. Upon their arrival, the Pandavas were met with hollow cheers and escorted by the unctuously welcoming Purakana. Yudhishthir, his senses heightened by Vance's warning, paced the gleaming halls and immediately sensed the rot beneath the gilding. There was a cloying, waxy sweetness in the air that defied the freshness of the morning. Benjamin, with his keen, primal senses, confirmed the horror, pressing a thumbnail into a wall and feeling the telltale, nauseating softness of the lac beneath the plaster. They were living inside their own funeral pyre. They resolved that their only defense was to lull their captor into a false sense of security. They played the part of grateful guests, praising the architecture and settling into a routine of hunting by day and sleeping within the death trap by night. True to Vance's word, a secret contact arrived, a master miner who sought them out in the dead of night. For months, while the Pandavas maintained their charade of leisure, this man labored in silence, carving a cavernous tunnel that originated in the center of the palace and snaked deep underground, emerging far beyond the city walls into the safety of the dense, riverbank forest. As the tunnel neared completion, Purakana grew impatient. Seeing the princes living with such apparent ease, he decided the time was ripe. He sent word to Donovan Sterling. The house would be set ablaze on the night of the new moon, when the absolute darkness would cloak his atrocity. But the Pandavas chose to strike first. Yudhishthir announced a grand almsgiving feast. During the festivities, a nomadic woman and her 5 sons, drawn by the scent of free food, drank too deeply of the rice wine and fell into a heavy, drunken stupor in a corner of the main hall. Late that night, long after the last guest had departed, Yudhishthir gave the signal. Benjamin moved like a silent shadow through the doomed structure. He first ensured Purakana's quarters were sealed, then ignited the palace at several key points. The house, engineered to consume, erupted into a violent, roaring inferno. As the flames clawed at the night sky like jagged fingers, the 5 brothers and their mother slipped into the mouth of their secret tunnel. They plunged into the cool, suffocating earth just as the house of auspiciousness collapsed into a mountain of ash, taking the murderous Purakana and the 6 unsuspecting souls with it. Deep beneath the surface, the Pandavas scrambled through the darkness, the muffled, subterranean roar of the inferno serving as a terrifying reminder of their near obliteration. They finally breached the surface into the cool, midnight air of the forest, gasping for breath, their faces smeared with soot, the acrid stench of their own funeral pyre clinging to their garments. Their status, their wealth, and their very identities had been incinerated. They were now fugitives, stripped of everything but the raw, visceral will to survive. The flight was grueling. Constance and her sons, unaccustomed to such primal hardship, soon saw their strength failing them. It was Benjamin, his body thrumming with the potent, supernatural vitality of the Naga's elixir, who became their vessel of salvation. Hoisting his mother onto his broad shoulders, tucking the twins under his arms, and guiding Yudhishthir and Arthur, he crashed through the dense undergrowth with the force of a stampeding elephant. He carried the entire weight of his family's future on his back, a titan forging a path through the wilderness. Back in Hastinapura, the news from Valley View was met with a theater of grief. When the charred remains were discovered, they were identified as the Pandavas. The city was draped in mourning. King Dhritarashtra wept openly for the nephews he had condemned, while Donovan Sterling delivered a performance of sorrow so convincing it nearly eclipsed the truth. Only Vance, in his private chambers, mourned with a silent, ironclad resolve, knowing that the fire had not killed the fireborn, but had instead tempered them into something far more dangerous. The world believed the Pandavas were dead, an accident that paved Donovan's way to absolute power. Meanwhile, deep in a forbidding forest, the exhausted fugitives had collapsed into sleep, all save for Benjamin, who stood vigil, his senses alert to the slightest rustle of the wind. Their presence did not go unnoticed. A cannibalistic Rakshasa named Hidimba, a monstrous, foul-smelling creature of the deep woods, caught the scent of human flesh on the breeze. He dispatched his sister, Hidimba, to lure the mortals into his cooking pot. Hidimba was a Rakshasi, and while she possessed the fearsome, dark powers of her kin, she also harbored the rare ability to shapeshift into a form of breathtaking human beauty. When she crept through the trees and laid eyes upon the powerfully built Benjamin standing his guard, her predatory mission was instantly erased, replaced by an overwhelming, inexplicable infatuation. She approached him not as a monster, but as a lovely maiden, her voice a soft, tremulous whisper in the night. She warned him of her brother's gruesome appetite and pleaded with him to take his family and flee with her. Benjamin, ever the protector, scoffed at the notion of running from a mere demon. His refusal to retreat was soon justified by the arrival of Hidimba himself, a nightmare made flesh, with glowing red eyes and fangs like daggers, roaring with fury at his sister's perceived betrayal. A colossal battle erupted between the prince and the monster. The combatants uprooted towering trees to use as clubs, their blows shaking the very earth. But the Rakshasa, for all his demonic strength, was no match for a man who possessed the raw power of 10,000 elephants. Benjamin toyed with him, exhausted him, and then, with a final, brutal display of ferocity, he broke the demon's body in two. The commotion had awakened the rest of the family, who emerged to witness the aftermath. The broken corpse of a monster and a beautiful woman weeping at Benjamin's feet. Hidimba, now liberated from her brother's tyranny, fell at Constance's feet and begged for her son's hand in marriage. The Pandavas were taken aback, but they were a pragmatic group. They were alone, vulnerable, and in need of allies in a world that presumed them dead. An alliance with a powerful, supernatural being offered strategic advantages. Yudhishthir and Constance agreed to the union, but with strict conditions. Benjamin would remain with her only until she bore him a son, and he must continue to live and train with his brothers by day, returning to her only under the veil of night. Hidimba joyfully accepted. Such was her magical nature that she conceived and gave birth to a son that very same day. The child, named Gatotkacha, was born as a full-grown, bald-headed giant, a formidable warrior who was half man, half Rakshasa. Possessing his mother's command over illusion and his father's monstrous strength, he swore a solemn oath to his family. He would appear at their side the moment they ever signaled for his aid. Then, with a final farewell, he and his mother vanished into the sky, leaving the Pandavas to continue their journey through the dark, uncharted heart of the wilderness. The casually spoken words of the Queen Mother, "Share it equally amongst all of you," hung in the stagnant air of the room like a death sentence. In an instant, what had begun as an absent-minded maternal directive transformed into a sacred, irrevocable command. Draupadi, the fire-born princess whose hand had been won by the greatest archer of the age through a feat of impossible skill, stood frozen in a state of horrified disbelief. To her, the notion was an affront to her dignity. She was not a mere trinket of charity, nor a bowl of alms to be divided among beggars. The Pandava brothers themselves were plunged into a state of paralyzed shock, caught between the sheer ecstasy of their brother's victory and the soul-crushing, impossible implications of their mother's decree. Only Yudhishthir, for whom the letter of the law, the Dharma, was a force more absolute than personal desire or societal convention, remained resolute. A mother's word, once uttered, could not be unsaid. It was a cosmic tether that must be obeyed, regardless of the cost to their hearts. News of this bizarre, unprecedented marital arrangement rippled through the kingdom, eventually reaching King Drupada just as he was beginning to celebrate his good fortune. When he learned that the mysterious Brahmin who had claimed his daughter was none other than the long-presumed dead Arjuna, his joy knew no bounds. His life's ambition, to see his daughter wed to the one warrior capable of challenging Drona, had been fulfilled. However, this joy curdled into incandescent rage when he was informed of the Pandavas' intention to have all 5 brothers share a single wife. He summoned them to the palace, his face a mask of royal fury, ready to condemn this outrageous breach of all known tradition. It was then that the great sage Vyasa, the grandfather of the princes, made one of his timely, almost theatrically convenient appearances. As he so often did during moments of existential dynastic crisis, he arrived to soothe the troubled waters of fate with a revelation from a higher reality. He explained to the furious Drupada that this unconventional union was not the product of a misunderstanding, but the orchestration of divine will. In a previous life, the soul that was now Draupadi had performed severe, agonizing austerities, praying to the god Shiva for a husband. 5 times she had uttered her prayer, each time asking for a man who possessed a different supreme quality. Shiva, granting her boon, had informed her that because no single mortal man could contain such vast, conflicting perfections, her wish would be granted in her next life through 5 distinct husbands. The Pandavas, Vyasa explained, were the literal manifestation of that boon. Yudhishthir possessed ultimate righteousness. Bhima held unrivaled, mountain-shaking strength. Arjuna possessed supreme martial skill. Nakula held unmatched beauty, and Sahdeva possessed the deepest wisdom. Placated by this divine sanction, Drupada finally consented. A magnificent wedding was held, and Draupadi was formally joined to all 5 brothers, her destiny now inextricably woven into their turbulent lives. The news of the Pandava survival and their powerful new alliance with the Panchala kingdom exploded like a thunderclap over the court of Hastinapura. For Duryodhana, it was a waking nightmare. The enemies he had considered reduced to ash were not only alive and well, but stronger than ever. Consumed by a toxic cocktail of rage and fear, he, along with his brothers Dusasana and Vikarna, pleaded with King Dhritarashtra to take a hard line. They urged him to refuse to recognize the Pandavas' legitimacy and to mobilize the royal army for a war to extinguish their claim once and for all. But the elder statesmen of the court, Bhishma, Drona, and Vidura, argued forcefully for peace. The Pandavas were the sons of the former king, beloved by the people and now backed by the formidable military might of Drupada. To deny them their birthright would be not only unjust but strategically suicidal. It would plunge the kingdom into a civil war it could not win. Dhritarashtra, ever the weak-willed and pliable ruler, was caught in the crossfire between his son's venomous hatred and the elders' sober wisdom. He chose, as he always did, the path of least resistance, a fragile, hollow compromise. He dispatched Vidura with a formal invitation, welcoming his long-lost nephews back to the kingdom under the guise of reconciliation. Their return to Hastinapura was not the triumphant homecoming of wronged princes, but a tense, suffocating reunion, heavy with the weight of unspoken resentments. To avert the open conflict that simmered just beneath the surface, the elders brokered a deal. The kingdom was divided. Duryodhana and his brothers would retain control of the ancestral capital of Hastinapura, with all its wealth, infrastructure, and fertile lands. The Pandavas, in turn, were granted their share, a vast, desolate, and cursed tract of land on the banks of the Yamuna River known as Kandavaprastha. This was no generous offer. Kandavaprastha was a snake-infested, entirely undeveloped wilderness, a place of grim legends that civilized men had avoided for centuries. It was the equivalent of being gifted a toxic wasteland and being told to call it a country estate, a calculated insult, a political exile thinly veiled as a gift. Yet Yudhishthir, in his endless, exhausting quest to avoid conflict, accepted the offer without a single word of argument. He would rather build a kingdom from the dust than spill the blood of his kin. The site of Kandavaprastha is traditionally identified with the land that now holds modern-day Delhi, a city that has been continuously inhabited for millennia. Archaeological excavations at the Old Fort, or Puranakila, have uncovered painted gray ware pottery dating to the period often associated with the Mahabharata, around 1000 BCE. While no grand palaces remain, this evidence of ancient settlement lends a fascinating layer of reality to the story, anchoring this mythical act of creation to a place of real, enduring historical importance. Accompanied by their mother Kunti, their wife Draupadi, and their divine cousin and guide Krishna, the Pandavas traveled to their new, barren realm. Krishna, surveying the desolate landscape, knew that mortal hands alone could not tame such a place. With the Pandavas, he invoked Agni, the god of fire, asking him to consume the entire forest to clear the land for their new city. The forest was the home of the Naga king Takshaka and was protected by the god Indra himself. But Agni was ravenous. To aid in the coming conflagration, the fire god gifted Arjuna with the Gandiva, an unbreakable bow, and 2 quivers that would never run out of arrows, along with a magnificent white chariot. To Krishna, he gave the Sudarshana chakra, a divine discus of immense, world-ending power. Together, Arjuna and Krishna held off the armies of the gods while Agni consumed the entire forest in a great inferno, a ritual of destruction that was, in its essence, an act of creation. With the land cleared and consecrated by fire, Maya, the architect of the Asuras, whose life had been spared in the blaze, offered his services to the Pandavas in gratitude. He promised to build them a city and an assembly hall the likes of which the world had never seen. He was true to his word. On the scorched earth of Kandavaprastha rose a new city, which they named Indraprastha, the city of Indra. It was a marvel of planning and beauty, featuring wide boulevards, fragrant gardens, and gleaming white towers that seemed to scrape the heavens. But its crown jewel was the assembly hall Maya built for Yudhishthir. It was a palace of illusions, a masterpiece of arcane architecture. Its floors were polished so perfectly that they shimmered like pools of still water, while actual pools of water were so magically clear that they appeared to be solid, gem-studded floors. Walls were shimmering illusions, and doorways were hidden in plain sight. It was a place of breathtaking, disorienting beauty, designed to awe and humble all who entered. The Pandavas, having been given a wasteland out of spite, had used divine aid to carve a paradise from the wilderness. News of the glorious city of Indraprastha traveled fast, and its splendor only served to deepen the darkness in Duryodhana's heart. Its gleaming towers cast a long, envious shadow all the way back to Hastinapura. With Indraprastha firmly established, a period of peace and prosperity blossomed. Yudhishthir ruled with such unwavering justice and compassion that his kingdom became a beacon of good governance, attracting the best and brightest from across the land. The people were happy, the granaries were overflowing, and the law was respected. It was a golden age in miniature. One day, the celestial sage Narada visited their new court. As he surveyed the splendor of the magical assembly hall and witnessed the righteous rule of the king, he planted a seed of grander ambition. He spoke of Pandu, the king's pious father, who now resided in the heavens but could not ascend to the highest celestial realm, that of Indra, until his son achieved the ultimate status a mortal king could attain. He urged Yudhishthir to perform the Rajasuya Yajna, the imperial sacrifice, a complex and perilous ritual that, if successfully completed, would declare him Samrat, the emperor of all the known world. The idea was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. To declare oneself emperor was to invite the challenge of every other king who considered himself worthy. Yudhishthir, ever cautious, sought the counsel of his wisest advisor, Krishna. "Do you believe it is my place to reach for such heights, Krishna?" Yudhishthir asked, his brow furrowed with the weight of the potential burden. "Only you, Yudhishthir, possess the virtue required to become a true emperor," Krishna replied, his eyes reflecting a deep, knowing calm. "But there is one colossal obstacle standing in our way, the mighty and tyrannical emperor of Magadha, Jarasandha." Jarasandha was a fearsome figure, a man whose origin story was as twisted as his heart. Born as two separate, lifeless halves to two different mothers, his distraught father had cast the pieces into the forest. A Rakshasi named Jara had found them and, out of morbid curiosity, pushed the two halves together. Miraculously, they had fused into a single living child. He was a being of unnatural strength and savage cruelty, and at that time, he had conquered and imprisoned nearly 100 other kings in his dungeons, intending to sacrifice them all in a grand, bloody ritual to attain absolute power. "So long as this tyrant lives, no Rajasuya is possible," Krishna explained, his voice low. "For he will never bow his head to another. Jarasandha must be eliminated." A direct military invasion of Magadha was out of the question. Jarasandha's fortress was impregnable. Krishna devised a plan for a covert operation. He, Bhima, and Arjuna disguised themselves as traveling Brahmins and journeyed to Jarasandha's capital. They entered his court as supplicants, taking advantage of the emperor's one known virtue, a pious vow never to refuse a request made by a Brahmin. Once granted an audience, they revealed their true identities. Jarasandha was furious at the deception, but his honor bound him to his vow. Krishna, speaking for the trio, made his request. He asked not for gold or land, but for the gift of single combat. Jarasandha, a formidable wrestler himself, laughed at the challenge. He dismissed Arjuna as too slight and Krishna as a mere cowherd beneath his notice. His eyes fell upon the massive, granite-like frame of Bhima, and he chose him as his opponent. What followed was a wrestling match of legendary proportions. For 13 days and nights, the two titans battled without rest, their thunderous blows shaking the very foundations of the palace walls. They were almost perfectly matched in strength and stamina. Several times, Bhima managed to gain the upper hand and tear Jarasandha's body in two, but each time the two halves would magically crawl back together and fuse, leaving the emperor whole and unharmed. Bhima was nearing the point of exhaustion, his seemingly impossible task draining his will. He looked to Krishna for a sign, any hint of how to defeat this unkillable foe. Krishna, watching calmly from the sidelines, picked up a single blade of grass. He tore it in two down the middle, and then, with a meaningful look at Bhima, he threw the two resulting halves in opposite directions. Bhima understood instantly. Gathering his remaining strength, he lifted Jarasandha high, spun him around, and with a final, desperate roar, ripped his body in two one last time. But this time, he threw the right half of the body to his left and the left half to his right. The magical healing was confounded, the unnatural fusion broken for good, and the tyrant of Magadha was finally dead. They freed the captive kings, who all gratefully swore their allegiance to Yudhishthir as their new emperor. With Jarasandha gone, the path was clear. Yudhishthir dispatched his 4 brothers in the 4 cardinal directions on a Digvijaya Yatra, a tour of conquest to formally establish his dominion. This was a real-world political practice in ancient India, a king's way of consolidating power through a mix of military might and diplomacy, demanding tribute and fealty. Arjuna rode north into the Himalayas. Bhima went east, Sahdeva south, and Nakula west. They defeated those who resisted and accepted the peaceful submission of others, returning months later with a river of treasure and the sworn allegiance of every kingdom in the land. Finally, it was time for the ceremony itself. Invitations were sent to every corner of the world, and kings, sages, and merchants flocked to the glorious city of Indraprastha. The Pandavas' court was overflowing with a display of wealth and power the world had never before seen. It was their moment of absolute triumph. As part of the ritual, a special offering of respect, an aragya, was to be made to the most honored guest present. On the advice of the wise Bhishma, Yudhishthir chose to bestow this honor upon Krishna. This act, however, enraged one of the visiting kings, Shishupala, who held a deep-seated, virulent personal hatred for Krishna. He leapt to his feet and began a furious tirade, insulting Krishna with a stream of the most vile and creative abuses imaginable. Krishna listened with an eerie, chilling calm. He had once promised Shishupala's mother that he would forgive her son 100 offenses. As Shishupala's insults continued, Krishna quietly kept count. When the enraged king finally crossed the line and uttered his 101st offense, Krishna's patience ended. He raised his hand, and the Sudarshana chakra appeared, spinning and blazing. It flew across the great hall, decapitated Shishupala in a flash of light, and returned to his finger before anyone could even gasp. The ceremony then continued as if nothing had happened. The Rajasuya was a resounding success, and Yudhishthir was formally consecrated as emperor. In the days that followed, Duryodhana, who had been forced to attend and witness his cousin's ultimate victory, was given a tour of the magical assembly hall. It was here that his smoldering jealousy was fanned into an inferno of pure, unadulterated hatred. The hall's illusions made a fool of him at every turn. Staring at a floor of polished crystal that looked exactly like a pool of water, He hiked up his robes to avoid getting wet, only to realize his mistake to the sound of snickering from guards. A few steps later, he strode confidently onto what he thought was a solid floor, only to fall with a great splash into an actual pool of water, so magically clear it had been invisible. This time, the laughter was loud and unrestrained. Bhima's booming, thunderous laugh was the loudest of all, and it is said that Draupadi, watching from a balcony, laughed too, adding the cutting, unforgettable remark, "The son of a blind man is also blind." Mortified and dripping, Duryodhana then walked straight into a crystal wall he mistook for an open doorway. Each blunder, each burst of laughter was a fresh, jagged stab to his pride. He left Indraprastha a changed man. His soul had been poisoned by a humiliation so profound that it eclipsed all political rivalry. The war was no longer about a kingdom. It was now about avenging his wounded, bleeding pride. Duryodhana returned to the stately, familiar halls of Hastinapura a broken man, but his affliction was not of the body. It was a sickness of the soul, a raging fever of envy that had been stoked into a firestorm by the humiliations he had endured in Indraprastha. The magical, gleaming palace of his cousins had made his own ancestral home feel drab and provincial. Their unimaginable wealth made his own treasury seem like a pauper's chest. But worst of all, the sound of laughter, Bhima's booming, contemptuous roar, and Draupadi's sharp, mocking chuckle echoed relentlessly in the chambers of his mind. He took to his rooms, refusing food, speaking to no one, and pacing like a caged animal. He was no longer just jealous of the Pandavas. He wanted to see them utterly ruined. He wanted to strip them of their glory and grind it into the dust. It was in this dark, suffocating state that his uncle Shakuni found him. The cunning prince of Gandhara, with his perpetual, uneven limp and eyes that glittered with a patient, ancient malice, listened to his nephew's woes. Duryodhana spoke of raising an army or, failing that, of taking his own life. Shakuni merely smiled, a thin, cruel twisting of his lips. "War is for fools, my nephew," he hissed, his voice like the dry, slithering sound of a snake in the grass. "It is unpredictable, costly, and the Pandavas, with their powerful allies, are not easily defeated. And suicide? That is the path of the pathetic." "Then what would you have me do, uncle?" Duryodhana spat, his voice trembling with desperation. "Grief is for the weak," Shakuni whispered. "A true king does not weep. He plots." He then offered Duryodhana a path to victory that required no armies, no bloodshed, and no risk. It was a victory that could be won in a single afternoon in the quiet, stifling air of a royal hall. "Yudhishthir has a fatal weakness," Shakuni murmured, leaning in close. "He has a passion for the game of dice, but he has no skill for it. And as it happens," he added, tapping a pouch at his side with long, spindly fingers, "I have all the skill in the world. My dice do not merely fall, my nephew. They obey." The plan was as simple as it was diabolical. Yudhishthir's rigid adherence to the Kshatriya code of honor meant that he could not, under any circumstances, refuse a formal challenge to a game, especially one issued by his sovereign, King Dhritarashtra. To do so would be an admission of fear, an act of cowardice unthinkable for an emperor. They would invite him for a friendly game, and Shakuni, with his magically enchanted dice, would systematically strip him of everything he owned. Hope, for the first time in weeks, returned to Duryodhana's eyes. They went at once to the blind king. Duryodhana poured out his misery, describing the Pandavas' opulence and his own unbearable torment with such theatrical despair that his father's heart ached for him. Dhritarashtra, though he knew gambling was a gate to hell, could not bear to see his favorite son in such pain. His own secret, festering envy of Pandu's successful sons gnawed at his resolve. When the wise Vidura got wind of the plan, he rushed to the king, pleading with him to forbid the game, warning that it was a dishonest charade that would lead to the ruin of their entire dynasty. But the blind king's love for his son was greater than his wisdom. He overruled Vidura, commanding that a new, magnificent assembly hall be built for the occasion, and that Vidura himself must travel to Indraprastha to extend the formal royal invitation. Vidura arrived in the brilliant court of Indraprastha with the demeanor of a man forced to deliver a death sentence. He conveyed the king's command for Yudhishthir to attend a celebratory dice game. Yudhishthir knew instantly that this was no friendly invitation. He could smell the trap, a stench of corruption that clung to the very air. "A game of dice is a source of quarrels," he said to Vidura, his voice heavy with foreboding. "Wise men do not advise it, but if it is the command of my uncle, the king, I cannot refuse." His brothers stood by in silence, their faces grim, but they did not challenge the decision. Yudhishthir's dharma was absolute. He would walk into the serpent's pit with his eyes wide open rather than dishonor his king by refusing a challenge. The Pandavas and Draupadi journeyed to Hastinapura. They were greeted with cloying smiles and false welcomes, then escorted into the newly built gambling hall. The atmosphere within was electric with tension. The great elders of the clan, Bhishma, Drona, Kripa, and Vidura, all took their seats, their faces like stone masks, their silence a form of passive consent to the crime about to unfold. The game began. Yudhishthir sat opposite Shakuni, who rolled the dice on Duryodhana's behalf. The first stake was a string of rare pearls. Shakuni gathered the dice, whispered to them, and let them fly. "Here I win," Shakuni cried, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. And so he did. Yudhishthir, with a forced, tight smile, staked 1,000 jars of gold. Again, the dice obeyed Shakuni. The stakes grew higher. Chariots, horses, elephants, the royal treasury, the cattle of the kingdom. All were wagered, and all were lost with each maddeningly perfect roll of Shakuni's dice. The game of Pasha, as it was known, had a long history of destruction in the Republic, mentioned in sacred texts like the Rig Veda as a source of absolute ruin. It was a well-known cultural anxiety, a recognized vice, and Yudhishthir, the wisest of men, was falling headlong into its most classic destructive trap. Caught in the hypnotic, rhythmic cycle of loss and stung by Shakuni's incessant, venomous taunts, Yudhishthir's reason began to fray. He gambled away the freedom of all his servants. He lost the entire kingdom of Indraprastha, the city his brothers had built from the ashes of a cursed forest. He had nothing left. "You have lost your kingdom," Shakuni sneered, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "But you have not lost everything. You still have your brothers to wager." A collective gasp went through the hall. In a moment of sheer gambling madness, Yudhishthir placed his brother Sahdeva as a stake. He lost. Then he staked Nakula. He lost. Driven on by Shakuni's goading, he staked Arjuna, the greatest hero of the world, and then Bhima, the very strength of their family. With 4 rolls of the dice, the 4 Pandava brothers were stripped of their royalty and became the slaves of Duryodhana. Shakuni let the horror of that moment sink into the marrow of the assembly. Then he leaned forward, his voice a silken poison. "There is one person left, Yudhishthir. You have lost your brothers, but you have not yet lost yourself. Stake yourself, and with one roll you can win everything back." In a final, desperate act of delusion, Yudhishthir bet his own freedom. Shakuni scooped up the dice, cast them, and cried out his victory. Emperor Yudhishthir, the king of justice, was now a slave. His kingdom, his wealth, his brothers, and his own body now belonged to his hated cousin. The game should have been over. The ruin should have been complete, but the worst was yet to come. Shane Sterling's eyes, burning with a bottomless, voracious malice, swept across the assembly hall and fixed upon the ultimate prize. The air in the room grew heavy, curdled by his predatory gaze. "O king," he sneered, his voice dripping with a caustic, artificial deference that made the title sound like a death sentence. "A slave owns nothing. It seems, however, that your memory has failed you at this final, pivotal hour. you still possess one last, exquisite jewel. You have your wife, stake the princess. A harrowing, deathly silence descended upon the hall. The very suggestion that the Empress Dradi should be tossed into the gambler's furnace was so perverse, so violently opposed to the tenets of civilized conduct, that it seemed to suction the oxygen from the room. The elders, men who had sat in paralyzed complicity while a kingdom was systematically plundered, finally found their voices, murmuring, "Shame! Shame!" But their protests were merely the soft, impotent flutter of dry leaves. They were whispers devoid of action. They lacked the courage to halt the inevitable. Every eye swung toward Justin Sterling. He sat motionless, a statue hewn from the raw marble of his own grief. His mind was a ruin, his will obliterated by the sheer, crushing totality of his defeat. He was a man drowning in the final, desperate throes of his addiction, convinced, with the distorted logic of the terminal gambler, that the next roll of the ivory dice was the only thing that could mend his shattered world. In a voice barely audible, barely human, he whispered his consent. He staked his wife, Shane Sterling, his eyes gleaming with the manic, intoxicating thrill of this ultimate desecration, scooped up the dice. He rattled them against the palm of his hand, a sound like dry bone clicking against bone, and cast them upon the board. As they settled, he screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying, jagged glee. "She is won!" Donovan Sterling erupted in a triumphant roar that shook the rafters. The Pandavas, masters of the world only hours before, were now not only slaves, but witnesses to the final humiliation. Their queen, the sacred fire-born empress of Indraprastha, had been dragged into their servitude. Duryodhana, swelling with a sense of stolen power, turned toward the wise minister, Victor Vance. "Go," he commanded, his voice thick with the intoxicating poison of arrogance. "Fetch our new serving maid, Dradi. Her husbands no longer hold the authority to command her. Bring her here to sweep the floors of this hall." Victor Vance, who had been simmering in a crucible of silent, incandescent rage, finally erupted. "You are a fool spewing wicked words," Vance shouted, his finger trembling as he pointed toward the prince. "You do not realize that you are hanging by a frayed thread over a bottomless, terrifying abyss. You are architects of your own total destruction." He turned to the assembly, arguing with desperate passion that Dradi could not legally be wagered, for Yudhishthira had already surrendered his own freedom. A slave, by the laws of the land, possessed no property to lose. Enraged by this open defiance, Donovan Sterling bypassed the minister and dispatched a court usher, Pratikaman, to execute the order. The usher entered Dradi's private chambers, his voice trembling as he delivered the unthinkable news. Dradi was a woman of noble spirit and sharp intelligence, but in that moment of supreme crisis, her mind remained as honed as a razor. She did not weep. Instead, she forged a weapon out of pure, cold logic. "Return to the assembly," she commanded the usher, her voice steady. "Ask the king who wagered me this. Whom did you lose first, yourself or me?" It was a brilliant legal parry, a question designed to cast the entire validity of the final bet into the shadow of doubt. If Yudhishthira had forfeited his own freedom first, he lacked the legal standing to stake her. If he had wagered her while still a sovereign, the bet remained in a gray zone of legality. The usher returned to the hall and posed the question. Yudhishthira sat with his head buried in his hands, unable or unwilling to answer. The great legal minds of the court, Bill Sterling and Drona, exchanged glances, utterly stumped by the paradox of Dharma. It was a moral and legal crisis with no easy resolution. Donovan Sterling, indifferent to legal nuance and weary of the delay, grew impatient. His victory felt hollow without the presence of his prize. He turned to his younger brother, Dean Sterling. "This usher is a coward, fearful of the sons of Paul Sterling," he sneered. "You, Dean Sterling, go and drag her here by force." Dean Sterling, a man of base, animalistic cruelty, required no further goading. He stormed into the queen's chambers. He found Drati who, in the midst of her monthly cycle, was dressed in a single unstitched piece of cloth, the traditional garment for a woman in that state of ritual separation. As she turned to flee, Dean Sterling grabbed her by her long, dark, unbound hair that had been consecrated at the imperial sacrifice and was never meant to be touched by any man save her husband, and began to drag her. He hauled her from her sanctuary, through the cold corridors, her feet stumbling against the marble as she was paraded toward the great assembly hall like a common trophy. He threw her into the center of the court, disheveled, weeping, clad only in her single stained garment. She made her final, desperate appeal. Her eyes scanned the rows of silent elders, the supposed guardians of Sterling honor. She looked at Bill Sterling, the patriarch. She looked at Drona, the teacher. She pleaded for justice, for an answer to her query. Was she a slave or a free woman? They remained silent, their eyes downcast, paralyzed by a rigid adherence to protocol, their lingering loyalty to the blind king, or their cowardice in the face of Donovan Sterling's wrath. Their silence was, in every sense, their complicity. Donovan Sterling, reveling in her degradation, committed the final, unforgivable insult. He uncovered his thigh, slapped it with a sharp, echoing crack, and lewdly invited the Empress of the Republic to sit upon his lap. Benjamin Sterling, who had been coiled in his seat like a caged lion, finally broke. He unleashed a roar of pure, murderous rage that vibrated through the very stones of the hall. He swore a terrible oath before the assembled court. One day, on the field of battle, he would personally rip open Donovan Sterling's chest, drink his blood, and shatter that very same thigh with his mace. Ignoring the threat, Donovan Sterling gave his final order to Dean Sterling. "This woman is our slave. A slave has no right to property, not even the clothes upon her back. Strip her." Laughing, Dean Sterling reached for the edge of Drati's garment. The Pandavas, bound by their catastrophic oaths, closed their eyes in anguish, unable to protect their own wife. Drati, realizing that no mortal man in that hall would intervene, let go of the cloth she had been clutching. She raised her hands in prayer, casting her voice not toward the court, but toward the cosmos, toward the one protector who had never forsaken her. "Chris Kaine," she cried out. "O Govinda, dweller of Dvarka, save me, for I am sinking into the ocean of the Kuru malice." Then the miracle occurred. As Dean Sterling tugged at the fabric, it did not fray. He pulled and pulled, but more and more fabric magically spooled out, replacing what he had torn away. He yanked with his full, brutish strength, but yards upon yards of multicolored silk piled up on the floor around him, a mountain of cloth rising at his feet. He pulled until he was slick with sweat and gasping for air, finally collapsing in a heap of exhausted, defeated rage. Drati remained clothed, her honor shielded not by the laws of men, but by the grace of the divine. A stunned silence gripped the court, shattered only by the distant, mournful howling of jackals outside. Evil omens began to manifest across the city. The blind king, Dhritarashtra, finally seized by a sudden, superstitious terror, realized they had crossed a line that invited the wrath of powers far beyond their mortal ken. In a desperate attempt to appease the heavens, he turned to Drati, his voice suddenly fawning and kind. He offered her a boon, any boon she desired. With immense, tragic dignity, she asked for the freedom of her husbands. He granted it instantly. She asked for the return of their kingdom and their weapons. He granted that too. In the span of a few heartbeats, through her sheer courage and the king's mounting dread, she had salvaged everything Yudhishthira had lost. But the image of her being dragged by her hair, the leering face of Dean Sterling, and the silent, complicit elders had been burned into the memory of every person present. It was an act of dishonor so profound, so tectonic, that it could never be forgiven. It had rendered the coming war for vengeance an absolute certainty. As the Pandavas prepared to depart the hall of their humiliation, a fragile sense of victory lingered, though it tasted of ash. They were free, yes, but they were also broken. They were ready to leave Hastinapura behind, to return to Indraprastha and nurse the deep, poisoned wound that had been inflicted upon their honor. But for Donovan Sterling, this reversal was an agony far worse than their initial victory. To have had everything in his grasp, their wealth, their freedom, their queen, only to see it snatched away by his father's cowering fear was an intolerable failure. He, along with his inner circle, stormed into his father's chambers, his face a mask of incandescent rage. "You have not made peace," Donovan roared, his fury white-hot. "You have merely rearmed a wounded, enraged serpent and set it loose in our house." Shane Sterling, ever the master of the manipulative moment, stepped forward with a solution. "One more game," he proposed, his voice a soothing balm on Donovan's fiery anger. "One final roll of the dice. The stakes," he explained, "would be different. This would not be a game for kingdoms or immediate slavery, but for time. The loser would be sentenced to 12 years of exile as ascetics in the forest, followed by a 13th year spent living incognito, in complete disguise within a populated kingdom. If their true identity were discovered at any point during that 13th year, the entire cycle of exile would be forced to begin again. It was a masterful trap, cloaked in the language of a fair wager. It was designed to remove the Pandavas from power for over a decade, allowing Donovan Sterling to consolidate his rule, bribe their allies, and systematically poison the minds of the people against them. The 13th year was the true masterstroke. The odds of 5 world-renowned warriors and their legendary queen remaining undiscovered for a full year were infinitesimally small, threatening to lock them in a perpetual, agonizing loop of exile. Dhritarashtra, seduced by this elegant solution, agreed. He commanded that the Pandavas be recalled. When the summons arrived, a grim, suffocating sense of fatality descended upon the brothers. They returned to the hall, and King Dhritarashtra laid out the terms. A wave of protest erupted from the brothers, but Yudhishthira silenced them. He was a man caught in the iron gears of his own rigid code of honor. To his mind, to refuse the challenge of his elder and his king was a sin greater than any other, a violation of his sacred duty as a kshatriya. Believing himself a pawn of a destiny he could not fight, he accepted. There was no drama, only a bleak, foregone conclusion. The dice were brought. Shane Sterling scooped them up, his smile a death's head grin. He cast them upon the board, and with that single roll it was over. The Pandavas had lost. As the reality of the sentence set in, the brothers were forced to discard their royal silks and jewels, donning the rough, itchy barkcloth of forest hermits. As they did so, Drati stood in fierce, silent dignity and made her own vow. She loosened her long, dark hair, letting it fall unbound around her shoulders. "It shall remain unwashed and unbraided," she swore. "A constant public symbol of my dishonor, until the day it can be cleansed in the blood of the man who ordered me stripped." They walked out of the gates of Hastinapura and into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The forest was more than trees. It was a space outside the laws of society, a realm of spiritual trial and transformation. Donovan Sterling believed he had cast his cousins into a void for 13 years. But he was not sending them to their end. He was sending them into a crucible that would forge them into the instruments of his own inevitable destruction. A single slip, a chance encounter with a sharp-eyed merchant or a wandering peddler, was all it would take to turn their 13 years of agonizing penance into ash. The cycle of exile was a fragile glass sculpture, and one fracture would force them back into the wilderness. After exhaustive deliberation, the 5 brothers and their wife chose the Matsya kingdom as their sanctuary. Ruled by King Virata, a man of noble intentions but perpetually distracted by the luxuries of his station, Matsya offered the perfect shadow. It was a kingdom prosperous enough to hide their brilliance, yet sufficiently isolated from the suffocating political webs of Hastinapura. Before stepping across the city gates, they performed a ritual of surrender. They took their celestial armaments, weapons forged by gods that hummed with a power too distinct to hide, and bundled them in silk and leather to resemble a desiccated corpse. High within the tangled, thorny branches of a remote shamey tree near the cremation grounds, they left their past behind. It was a macabre talisman, a grim sentinel designed to deter any curious soul from disturbing their heavy secrets. One by one, they entered Virata's capital, each shedding their royal skin to don the humble mantle of servitude. Udashira, the king of justice, presented himself at court as Kanka, a Brahmin whose mastery of the dice was as legendary as his patience. In a cruel twist of irony, he became the king's most trusted companion, advising Virata in the very vice that had once dismantled his own empire. Benjamin Sterling, the colossus of the family, transformed into Vallabha. He adopted the persona of a boisterous, prodigiously strong cook and wrestler. His massive, corded muscles and insatiable appetite were no longer signs of a prince, but the simple, brute traits of a man born to serve the royal kitchens. Nicholas Sterling, whose affinity for horses was like a language of the soul, took the name Granthika. He became a stable hand, his intuitive understanding of steeds so profound that he was rapidly elevated to the role of master of the royal stables. His twin, Samuel Sterling, applied his deep knowledge of animal husbandry as Tantapala, the chief cowherd, watching over the king's vast, sprawling herds. Drati, however, assumed the most treacherous burden. As Malini, a Sarandri, a highly skilled lady's maid and stylist, she claimed to be a widow formerly in the service of the late empress. Her innate grace could not be fully masked. It became her camouflage, earning her the position of chief attendant to Queen Sudeshna. And then there was Arthur Sterling, the greatest warrior the world had ever known. He embraced the paradoxical mercy of Urvashi's curse. As Brihanala, a eunuch adorned with clinking bangles, ornate earrings, and hair styled in a long, flowing braid, he presented himself as a master of music and dance. His performance was so absolute, so hauntingly delicate, that he was commissioned to teach the royal princess, Uthara, and the ladies of the court. For an entire year, they lived in a state of constant silent performance. They saw each other daily within the gilded halls of the palace. The advisor rolling the dice, the cook carrying the feast, the groom leading the chariot, the maid tending to her mistress, the dance teacher guiding the princess. Yet they were islands. They could not speak, nor could they share a meaningful look, communicating only through fleeting, coded glances that carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. It was a year of biting suspense and quiet humiliation, but the true threat did not simmer in the city streets. It lurked within the palace itself. Kichaka, the queen's brother and the commander-in-chief of the Matsya army, was a man whose strength was matched only by his staggering arrogance. His gaze soon fixated on the enigmatic and beautiful Malini. His pursuit became a relentless, predatory ordeal. Drati, bound by her vow of anonymity, was forced to fend him off with a desperate lie. She claimed to be protected by 5 powerful Gandharvas, celestial spirits, who would slaughter any man who dared dishonor her. But Kichaka was a man who viewed fear as a challenge. He coerced his sister, the queen, to send Drati to his private chambers with a jug of wine. There, the assault began. Drati fought, shoved him aside, and fled into the assembly hall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Kichaka, blind with lust and fury, pursued her. In the full, agonizing sight of King Virata and his entire court, he seized Drati by her hair, a harrowing echo of the trauma she had suffered years before, and cast her to the floor. King Virata, paralyzed by his fear of his powerful brother-in-law, remained silent. Udashira, cloaked in the guise of the humble Kanka, felt his fists clench until the knuckles turned white. His soul screamed for vengeance, yet his lips could only utter mild, hollow words of disapproval. Benjamin Sterling, watching from the kitchen shadows, felt a rage so pure and absolute that it threatened to shatter his disguise then and there. That night, a weeping Dottie crept into the kitchens to find Benjamin. Her words were like lashes, a searing indictment of the brothers' inaction. "Must I endure this until I am nothing but a memory?" she whispered, her voice trembling with betrayal. "If you are men, if you are warriors, then let the world burn before you let another hand lay itself upon me." Benjamin, his heart breaking under the weight of his own shame, made a vow that would silence the halls of Matcha forever. He and Dottie concocted a desperate, dark trap. She would feign a change of heart, agreeing to a midnight rendezvous in the royal dance hall. The vain general, drunk on his own ego, arrived in the pitch-black darkness. Expecting the embrace of the woman he had pursued, he reached out only to find the cold, unyielding iron of a hand that was not hers. It was Benjamin Sterling. The battle that followed was silent and savage. Benjamin, unleashing 12 years of suppressed exile and a year of forced humility, did not merely kill Kachaka. He systematically dismantled him, kneading flesh and bone together until the great general was reduced to a terrifying, shapeless mass of meat, a grotesque remnant that was no longer recognizable as human. The discovery of the remains at dawn sent a shudder of primal terror through the palace. Dottie's story of the Gandharv protectors was suddenly, terrifyingly believed by all. However, the ripple effect of the murder reached far beyond the borders of Matcha. When spies brought word of Kachaka's fate to Hastinapura, Donovan Sterling's cunning mind, sharpened by his advisors, began to piece together the mosaic of the truth. Kachaka was a titan. Only one man in the known world possessed the sheer, raw strength required to reduce him to such a state: Benjamin Sterling. "If the wolf is there," Donovan mused, his eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory light, "then the rest of the pack cannot be far behind." As the 13th year drew to its breathless conclusion, Donovan launched a two-pronged invasion of Matcha. It was a tactical masterpiece, a great cattle raid from both the north and the south, designed not for conquest, but to force the kingdom's mysterious, hidden protectors out of the shadows. The transition from a crucible of silence to the roar of war was instantaneous. The Trigarda army, aligned with the Kauravas, assaulted from the south. King Virata, still reeling from the loss of Kachaka, had no choice but to call upon his strange new servants. To his bewilderment, his cook, his Brahmin, and his herdsmen fought like gods descended from the heavens. Vallabha, the cook, ripped a tree from the earth and wielded it like a club, pulverizing entire battalions. When the dust settled, the Trigarda army was shattered, and their king was a prisoner. Yet, before Virata could even comprehend the miracle, a far more ominous shadow fell from the north. The main Kaurava army, a terrifying host led by the masters of the age, Bill Sterling, Drona, and Karna, had descended to claim the royal herds. The city fell into a paroxysm of panic. The only royal heir remaining was the young Prince Uthara, a boy whose braggadocio far outstripped his courage. Boasting to the court of his own prowess, he claimed he could rout the entire enemy host if only he had a charioteer worthy of his stature. In a moment of quiet, calculated brilliance, the disguised Dottie nudged the prince's sister to suggest the eunuch, Brihanala. "He served the great Arthur Sterling," she whispered. "There is no better hand at the reins." The prince, pushed into a corner by the expectations of the court, agreed. But the moment they crested the ridge and saw the horizon, a glittering, shifting ocean of the Kaurava army, banners snapping in the wind, the prince's bravado evaporated. He leaped from the chariot, trembling, and fled. Brihanala, with a laugh that echoed with the thunder of Arthur Sterling himself, steered the chariot with impossible grace, chased down the prince, and hauled him back by his hair. There, amidst the high grass, Arthur Sterling shed his mask. He forced the terrified boy to drive him to the sacred Shami tree. As he gripped the Gandiva bough, the 13-year term of their exile, calculated to the exact second by celestial motion, concluded. The curse of anonymity dissolved. The warrior had returned. What followed was a legend forged in the heat of conflict. Arthur Sterling took on the entire Sterling command structure alone. He fought with a brilliance that left Drona and Bill Sterling speechless. When he grew tired of the bloodshed, he unleashed the Samahanastra, a divine weapon of slumber, causing the entire enemy army to fall into a harmless, dreamless sleep. While they slept, he commanded the prince to harvest a piece of silk from each commander's banner as a trophy of their defeat. When they returned to the city, the truth could no longer be denied. The brothers revealed themselves. King Virata was stunned, but his humility and joy knew no bounds. He offered his daughter in marriage to Arthur, but Arthur, seeing her with the eyes of a teacher, declined. Instead, he claimed her hand for his son, the young hero Abhimanyu. A new, powerful alliance was born. The exile was over. The brothers established a court at Upaplavia, and the formal process of reclaiming their birthright began. They sent an envoy to Hastinapura with a message of ironclad resolve. The time of the wager has ended. The envoy stated to the blind king, "Return our half of the kingdom Indraprastha, as was sworn." But Donovan Sterling had no intention of honoring his word. When the envoy arrived, he was met with nothing but open disdain. "Return the land?" Donovan sneered, his voice ringing with an arrogance that invited the gods' judgment. "I would not yield a needle point of soil, not even for the sake of peace. If they want their kingdom, let them come and carve it from my chest." The world began to polarize. The drums of war, once a distant thunder, were now a deafening, constant beat. In a final, desperate act of diplomacy, Krishna himself, the divine statesman, offered to travel to Hastinapura as a final envoy of peace. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as a kinsman. His visit was a moral audit of the entire house of Sterling. He spoke to the elders, his words a symphony of reason and sorrow, begging them to avoid the slaughter. He offered a compromise so humble it was impossible to reject. Just 5 villages, one for each brother, to prevent the bloodbath of a generation. Even the elders, Bill Sterling and Drona, urged Donovan to accept. But Donovan's heart was a fortress of vanity. He rejected the villages, insulted the emissary, and ordered his soldiers to seize Krishna. As the guards stepped forward, the world seemed to tilt. Krishna laughed, and the assembly hall vanished. In its place was an infinite, blinding, incandescent light as Krishna revealed his Vishvarupa, his universal form. The universe swirled within him. Stars, galaxies, the rise and fall of civilizations. The elders saw their own deaths, their armies marching like moths into a consuming flame. When the vision faded, the hall was silent. The final chance for peace had been trampled. The armies gathered on the sacred plains of Kurukshetra, a place known as the Dharmakshitra, the field of righteousness. On the morning of the first day, both sides gathered in a glittering mile-long expanse of chariots and elephants. The air hummed with the inevitability of violence. Arthur Sterling asked Krishna to drive his chariot into the neutral space between the two hosts. He looked across the field and saw not enemies, but his own life. He saw his grandsire, Bill Sterling, who had nurtured him. He saw Drona, who had taught him to hold a sword. The weight of the horror shattered him. The Gandiva bough slipped from his hand. He collapsed onto the chariot floor, his mind a maelstrom of grief. "I will not fight," he whispered to Krishna, his voice ragged with despair. "What value is a kingdom if it is paid for in the blood of those I love? I would rather live as a beggar in the woods than rule over the ashes of my kinsmen." This moment was the birth of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna, seeing his friend paralyzed by human sorrow, began the discourse that would transcend time. He did not offer empty comfort. He offered the truth of the eternal soul. He spoke of the Dharma, the duty that transcends personal feeling. "You are a warrior, Arthur," Krishna said. His voice as steady as the turning of the spheres. "The body is but a garment. It is born and it dies, but the soul is eternal. You are not killing and you are not being killed. You are merely performing your duty in the cosmic cycle." He taught him the path of karma yoga, action without attachment. "You have the right to the work, but never to the fruits of the work," Krishna declared. "Fight not for victory, nor for the kingdom, nor for your own ego. Fight because it is the right thing to do, and leave the outcome to the heavens." The fever of doubt broke. The fire of despair was quenched by the cool water of divine wisdom. Arthur Sterling stood, his resolve now as hard as diamond, and reclaimed his bow. "My delusion is gone," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "I will do as you command." The conch shells blew, a deafening, sky-shattering roar. The two oceans of men surged forward, and the War of Sterling Fields began. For 9 days, Bill Sterling ruled the battlefield like a vengeful god, his white banner a beacon of terrifying power. He was an unstoppable force, a relic of an age of giants, carving a path of blood that left the Pandavas shattered, their morale fraying under the relentless, crushing weight of their grandsire's duty. Chris Kaine, who had long ago sworn to be a mere witness, an advisor bound by the vow of non-combatant status, found his resolve shattering under the weight of a divine, suffocating rage. He watched as Arthur Sterling hesitated, his movements ghosted by an ancient affection, refusing to unleash the full cosmic ferocity required to fell the man who had been his grandfather, his mentor, and his moral compass. Unable to watch the scales of destiny tip toward catastrophe, Chris broke his oath. He vaulted from the chariot, his feet hitting the mud with the force of a falling star, the Sudarshana chakra manifesting in his hand like a spinning blade of pure, blinding solar fire. He charged toward Bill Sterling, his eyes alight with the cold, absolute purpose of a god ensuring that the cycle of karma reached its zenith. Bill Sterling, seeing the Lord of the universe descending upon him with the judgment of an era in his hands, felt a profound, radiant peace wash over him. He cast his bow into the dust, bowed his head, and surrendered his spirit to the inevitability of the moment. It was Arthur Sterling who finally snapped out of his trance, scrambling from his chariot to physically throw himself at Chris's feet. He clawed at the hem of his friend's robes, begging him to halt, pleading with the tear-streaked desperation of a man clinging to his own soul. He promised, with a voice cracking from the strain, to fight with the devastating resolve required to end the stalemate. Chris paused, the spinning chakra fading to a dull, ominous hum, a chilling reminder of how close the Pandavas had come to witnessing the death of their own guiding light. By the 9th night, the weight of the war had carved trenches into the faces of the Pandava brothers. Justin Sterling, the eldest and most righteous, stood at the precipice of absolute ruin. Every strategy had failed. Every arrow fired against Bill Sterling had been rebuffed as if by a mountain. In a moment of radical humility that defied the norms of kingship, the brothers, guided by the silent, brooding presence of Chris Kaine, walked across the silent, corpse-strewn fields under a flag of truce. They entered Bill Sterling's pavilion, not as conquerors, but as suppliants. They knelt at the feet of the man who, only hours prior, had been raining death upon their ranks. Yudhishthira, his voice steady but heavy with grief, addressed the patriarch. "Grandsire, you are an immovable mountain, and we are but dust before you. You have blessed us with the words, 'May you be victorious.' Yet your blade is the very thing barring our path to that victory. We ask you as our elder and our protector, how may we defeat you, so that your own benediction may hold true?" Bill Sterling, his heart overflowing with a bittersweet love for these men he was fated to destroy, smiled. He looked upon them with eyes that saw the end of the age. My time has reached its dusk. My death is the price that Dharma demands for this new world to begin. He leaned forward, his voice a gravelly whisper of secrets. I am bound by an ancient vow. I have sworn never to raise a weapon against a woman, or against a soul who has once walked the path of womanhood. Seek out Shikandi. Place him at the vanguard of your attack. Shikandi was the reincarnation of Amelia Caswell, a princess whose life Bill had inadvertently shattered decades ago, and who had died with a vow of vengeance burned into her soul. Though she now walked as a man, Bill Sterling's spiritual sight saw only the Amelia of his past. He knew he could not lift a hand against her. This gender-fluid warrior became the linchpin of the entire conflict. It was a profound subversion of the rigid, masculine laws of ancient war. The most decisive weapon was not a sword or a chariot, but an identity that transcended the simple binaries of the battlefield. The morning of the 10th day dawned with a leaden sky. When Bill Sterling saw Shikandi at the front of the Pandava ranks, he did not see a soldier. He saw the face of the woman he had wronged, her eyes burning with a vengeance that had bypassed the gates of death. He lowered his bow. His long war had reached its conclusion. As Shikandi's arrows began to ping harmlessly against his golden armor, Arthur Sterling stepped from behind the cover of the chariot. Tears streamed down his face, carving tracks through the grime of battle. He raised his Gandiva, his hands trembling with the unbearable weight of duty. He began to rain arrows upon his grandsire. Bill stood motionless, a titan receiving his final, agonizing benediction. Hundreds of shafts pierced his form, pinning him in place until he swayed and collapsed. Yet he did not touch the earth. His body remained suspended, held aloft by a forest of arrow shafts, as if the very ground refused to claim a man of such stature. A collective cry rose from both armies, a sound of such profound, primordial grief that the war itself ground to a halt. For a moment, all hatred evaporated. Kauravas and Pandavas alike dropped their weapons and gathered around the fallen patriarch. Their enmity dissolved in the presence of a legend who had finally stopped fighting. Even in his defeat, Bill Sterling wielded his final boon, the power to choose his moment of departure. He refused to die immediately, choosing instead to lie upon his bed of arrows, a silent, bleeding observer watching the tragedy unfold. He asked for a pillow for his head, and when the fine silks of the royalty were offered, he rejected them with a weary shake of his head. He looked at Arthur Sterling. Without a word, Arthur fired 3 arrows into the ground, creating a cradle of wood and feathers for his grandfather's head. When Bill asked for water, Arthur struck the earth with another arrow, and a pure, crystal-clear spring, a gift from the river goddess herself, burst forth to quench the old man's thirst. The collapse of Bill Sterling sent a shockwave of despair through the Kaurava ranks, but for the Pandavas, the victory felt indistinguishable from a funeral. Drona, the master of arms, stepped into the void left by Bill. His heart was a battlefield of its own, torn between his duty to the throne and his paternal love for the Pandavas. However, as the tides of war shifted, he became a tactician of chilling precision. On the 13th day, he unleashed the Chakra Vyuha, a rotating, multi-layered labyrinth of soldiers. It was a swirling, deadly galaxy from which escape was mathematically impossible. Arthur Sterling was led away from the front by a calculated distraction, leaving the Pandava line vulnerable. In his absence, a young voice rose against the fear. Abram Sterling, Arthur's 16-year-old son. He claimed to know the secret of breaking the formation, having heard the technique described while still in his mother's womb. "I know how to enter the heart of the labyrinth," he proclaimed, his eyes shining with the fierce, uncontainable light of his father. But he admitted with a wry, tragic smile, "My father stopped the lesson before he told me how to get out." The boy, fueled by an unnatural, heroic adrenaline, smashed into the formation like a falling meteor. He carved a path deep into the enemy host, but the trap snapped shut behind him. His path was blocked and he was left isolated. What followed was not a battle. It was a martyrdom. The boy fought with a brilliance that left the veteran generals of the age in a state of stunned, shameful disbelief. Even Drona himself was shaken. When they finally broke their own code of honor to gang up on the teenager, stripping him of his chariot and weapons, he stood tall, using a broken wheel to defend himself until he was finally, mercilessly struck down. When Arthur Sterling learned of his son's slaughter, his grief didn't just manifest as tears. It transformed into a cold, terrifying, supernatural rage. He swore an oath that before the next sunset, he would have vengeance, or he would walk into the fire himself. The 14th day became a desperate, bloody race against the sun, with Arthur carving through the enemy ranks to reach the man responsible for the trap. On the 15th, Drona, maddened by the slaughter of his own allies, unleashed his full, cataclysmic power. Chris Kaine, knowing that Drona could not be defeated by force, sought the ultimate breach of honor. He convinced Yudhishthira, the man of absolute truth, to utter a lie. Ash is dead, they shouted, referring to the elephant, but leaving the name intentionally ambiguous. When Drona heard the words, the foundation of his soul collapsed. He dropped his weapons, entered a trance of despair, and was beheaded by an enemy prince. The death of Drona stripped the Kaurava army of its tactical mind, leaving them drifting in a sea of moral and strategic darkness. The end was a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. Kaine, the third Supreme Commander, faced Arthur Sterling on the 17th day in a duel that the gods themselves descended to witness. But Kaine was a man besieged by the ghosts of his own past. Parasurama's curse, a forgotten incantation, and the sinking of his chariot wheel into the blood-soaked mud rendered him vulnerable. As he stood helpless, trying to free his wheel, the rules of fair combat were invoked. "You dare speak of Dharma?" Chris Kaine's voice boomed across the field, cold as winter ice. "Where was your Dharma when you slaughtered the boy Abram? Where was your honor when you stood by as they tried to strip a queen naked?" Arthur Sterling's hesitation vanished, replaced by the ghost of his dead son's face. He raised the Gandiva and released the final, fatal shaft. As Kaine fell, a brilliant light emanated from his body, merging with the setting sun. The war was effectively over. The 18th day was merely the sound of the world ending. By the time the final dusk settled, the Kauravas were extinct, their kingdom a graveyard of brothers. Donovan Sterling fled into the shadows, a king without a throne, a man who had traded his soul for a pile of ashes. The Pandavas had won, but as they stood in the silence of the aftermath, the victory tasted only of cold, bitter, and eternal ash. Yudhishthira knew that their triumph was a hollow shell, an incomplete tapestry stained by the lingering presence of their nemesis, the architect of their exile and the architect of his own ruin. They tracked the lone fugitive to the edge of a desolate lake, a mirror of gray water reflecting a sky heavy with the soot of war. From a witness, they learned that Donovan Sterling, broken but defiant, had harnessed his waning magical powers to flash freeze the lake's surface, submerging himself into its icy depths in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the world above to forget his name. Yudhishthira stood at the water's edge, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade of righteous scorn. He did not call out as a king to a subject, but as a judge to a criminal. "Come out, Donovan Sterling, you coward, you shadow of a man who dares to call himself a Sterling. You hide beneath the ice like a frightened beast while the dynasty you claim to champion rots in the silt of Sterling fields, fed by the fruits of your own insatiable arrogance. Rise, face your destiny not as a fugitive, but as a kshatriya." Goaded by a rage that defied the freezing temperatures, Donovan burst from the surface, a spray of icy water turning into diamond shards in the air. His eyes were furnaces of undying hatred, his legendary mace gripped with knuckles white from tension. It was then that Yudhishthira, tethered to a rigid, often self-destructive sense of chivalric honor, made a proposal that struck Krishna as the zenith of folly. "Cousin," Yudhishthir declared, his voice steady despite the weight of the war's carnage. "Choose any one of us. Pick your weapon, choose your champion." Yudhishthir was gambling the future of an empire on a final, unnecessary roll of the dice, blinded by a code of honor that Donovan had discarded years ago. A cruel, jagged smirk twisted Donovan's lips. He knew his advantage. He knew exactly who could satisfy his thirst for retribution. "I choose the mace," he hissed, his voice echoing across the lake. "And I shall fight Bhima." The stage was set for the Gada Yuddha, a ritualized, brutal art of combat that had been their shared obsession since childhood. As they prepared, Balrama, the elder brother of Krishna and the master who had taught them both, arrived, summoned by the sage Narada to witness the finality of his students' rivalry. The combat was a clash of tectonic forces. Every strike of their maces sounded like a mountain cracking open, the shockwaves trembling through the very earth. They were mirror images of lethal intent, their hatred honed to a razor's edge over 13 years of exile. Bhima possessed the raw, untamed strength of the wind, while Donovan moved with the calculated, graceful lethality of a serpent. As the hours bled away, the tide began to shift. Donovan's superior technical refinement began to dismantle Bhima's momentum. Bhima's breath grew ragged, his movements desperate, his strength beginning to fail under the precision of his cousin's strikes. Arjuna, watching from the sidelines, turned to Krishna with terror clouding his eyes. "Bhima cannot win, Krishna. Donovan is the master of this field. He is going to break him." Krishna looked at him, his gaze dark, heavy with the weight of cosmic inevitability. He reminded Arjuna of the vow Bhima had sworn in that cursed assembly hall 13 years ago, the day Donovan had mocked Draupadi and slapped his thigh in base, public insult. Krishna caught Arjuna's eye and, with a subtle, decisive movement, slapped his own thigh. Arjuna understood. He signaled to Bhima. In that singular moment, the wall of honor shattered. The memory of Draupadi's unbound hair and the long years of humiliation flooded Bhima's mind. The sacred rules of Gada Yuddha, which forbade a blow below the waist, were suddenly nothing more than dust. As Donovan leaped, graceful and confident, Bhima sidestepped the path of the blow. With a roar that defied the laws of combat, he swung his mace not at the torso or the head, but with malicious, calculated force, straight into Donovan's thighs. The sound was sickening, a symphony of shattering bone and tearing sinew. Donovan crashed to the earth, his spine and legs crushed in a single dishonorable strike. Balrama let out a roar of fury, raising his plow to strike down Bhima for the betrayal of the rules, but Krishna stepped between them. "Look at the field, brother," Krishna commanded. "When an enemy has burned the very concept of dharma to the ground, to play by the rules is not honor. It is suicide." Balrama, disgusted, turned away. The Pandavas were victorious, but their triumph was forever poisoned. As Donovan lay gasping his final breaths in the dust, Bhima stepped forward and delivered a final, spiteful kick to his fallen cousin's head. Yudhishthir, though the moralist of the group, did not intervene until it was too late. The brothers walked away, leaving the once mighty king to die in the lonely silence of the lakeside, his body broken and his legacy reduced to a graveyard of his own making. The Great War, the furnace of the world, finally flickered out as the sun set on the 18th day, leaving the earth in a dark, suffocating quiet. But the dying heart of the war had one final, hideous spasm. The three remaining Kaurava warriors, Kripakarya, Kritavarma, and Ashvathama, found their king in the mud. With his final, rattling breaths, Donovan Sterling anointed Ashvathama as the commander of a phantom army, tasking him with a single, blood-soaked mission: bring him the heads of the 5 Pandavas. Hidden in the forest, watching a predatory owl massacre a nest of sleeping crows, Ashvathama found his dark inspiration. There was no dharma left. There was only the cold logic of the predator. He would not fight a war. He would conduct a slaughter. He entered the Pandava camp under the cloak of night, his soul infused with the demonic power of the architect of destruction. He moved through the tents like a whisper of smoke. He found 5 figures sleeping in a royal tent, and in his blood-blinded frenzy, he slaughtered them, believing he had ended the Pandava line. But they were not the brothers, they were the UPA Pandavas, the young sons of Draupadi. The camp became a butcher's shop. Shikandi, the soldiers, the servants, the horses, all were cut down. By dawn, the victorious army was a tomb. When the Pandavas returned to discover the butchery, the horror was total. Their children, their friends, their future, all lay mangled. Yudhishthir's howl of despair tore through the heavens, a sound that marked the end of any joy they would ever know. Draupadi, her heart a black diamond of grief, demanded vengeance. She would starve herself to death unless the killer was brought to justice. The pursuit led to a final, apocalyptic confrontation at the hermitage of Vyasa. Ashvatthama, cornered and desperate, unleashed a weapon of extinction, the Brahmashtra, aiming it at the wombs of the Pandava women to ensure no heir would ever rise to challenge him. Arjuna countered with his own weapon, but the sages stepped in to avert the annihilation of reality. Ashvatthama, unable to withdraw his strike, redirected it toward the womb of Princess Uttara, killing the unborn child. Krishna's divine detachment finally disintegrated. He cursed Ashvatthama to wander the earth for 3,000 years, a leper, an immortal outcast, shunned by all living things, smelling of the rot of his own sins. He then performed a miracle, breathing life back into the stillborn child, Parikshit, ensuring the lineage would survive even as the world around it fell into ruin. They returned to Hastinapura, a capital of widows. Dhritarashtra, blinded by rage, sought to crush Bhima in a final, murderous embrace, but Krishna replaced the warrior with an iron statue, which the old king pulverized with his grief-stricken strength. Gandhari, the queen who had lost everything, turned her gaze upon Krishna. She had seen his power, his ability to avert the slaughter, and his choice to let it unfold. "You watched my sons destroy one another, Lord," she whispered, her voice vibrating with the power of her accumulated righteousness. "You are the silent architect of this ruin. So I curse you. 36 years from this day, your own kin, the Yadavas, will turn upon each other in a drunken slaughter. You will be the sole witness to their end, and you will die alone, helpless in a forgotten forest." Krishna bowed his head. "I accept your curse, noble lady. It is merely the unfolding of what was already destined." The coronation of Yudhishthir was the final tragedy. He sat upon the throne as a king of ashes, his heart a cavern of guilt. He spoke of renouncing the world, of wandering into the forest to become a hermit, but Krishna insisted on one final journey. They traveled back to Sterling Fields to see Bhishma, the grandsire, lying upon his bed of arrows, waiting for the celestial alignment to release his soul. There, on the plain of death, Bhishma delivered the Shanti Parva, a monumental discourse on the duties of a king, the ethics of power, and the nature of salvation. In the shadow of his own death, the old warrior taught the king how to live, gifting him the wisdom to rule over a broken world. All of these lessons were framed as the final deathbed instruction from the world's most sagacious statesman. For many days, the Pandavas and a gathering of enlightened sages sat in solemn attendance as Bill Sterling, his voice thinned by the icy grip of mortality, yet his intellect burning with an unearthly, radiant intensity, unraveled the tapestry of Dharma. He spoke not in riddles, but with the stark clarity of a man who had seen the rise and fall of empires. He spoke first of Raja Dharma, the heavy burden of sovereignty. Yudhishthira, he noted, had been laboring under the delusion of a priest, his heart shackled to a sense of personal purity that had no place in the corridors of power. A king cannot afford the luxury of a spotless conscience, Bill rasped, his gaze fixed on the horizon. A king's primary duty is the survival and prosperity of his people. To secure that, he must be willing to walk through the fires of ruthlessness. He must be a lion to those who would devour his realm, yet a nurturing father to those who walk within its borders. He reminded them that a kingdom is not held together by prayers, but by the cold steel of a well-paid army and the overflowing coffers of a strong treasury. He warned Yudhishthira that idealism, when untempered by pragmatism, is merely a slow suicide of the state. He who is too soft, too eager to forgive, or too blinded by the light of his own morality, invites the shadows of chaos to dismantle his legacy. He then touched upon the duty during times of calamity. In the heart of a crisis, he explained, the rigid pillars of righteousness must occasionally be allowed to bend, lest they snap under the pressure of necessity. This was the final, soothing salve for Yudhishthira's festering guilt over the deceptions wrought at Drona and Kaine. Bil was teaching him that the world of men is a jagged, broken vessel, and that absolute moral purity is a ghost, something those who hold the reins of power can seldom hope to possess. He spoke of the soul's eternal nature and the arduous path toward liberation from the endless, suffocating cycle of rebirth. His words were a surging river of wisdom, washing over Yudhishthira's wounded spirit, scrubbing away the grime of his past actions and filling the hollow spaces of his heart with a profound, terrifying understanding of his purpose. Finally, after an eternity of teaching, the auspicious moment arrived. The winter solstice had turned the wheel of the year, and the sun began its long northern migration. Bill Sterling announced that his time was at hand. He offered his final, trembling blessings to his grandnephews, his mind now entirely surrendered to Chris Kaine, whom he revered as the ultimate architect of the universe. As he prepared to leave this plane, the dozens of arrow shafts that had long riddled his body spontaneously withdrew, as if reality itself recoiled from the sight of his martyrdom. The jagged wounds of the war miraculously sealed, leaving his skin as smooth and unblemished as it had been in the height of his youth. Then, as the family watched in breathless, reverent awe, a pillar of brilliant, blinding light erupted from the crown of his head. It soared into the firmament like a shooting star of pure spirit, vanishing into the celestial embrace. The soul of Bill Sterling, son of the river goddess, the grand patriarch whose binding vow had shackled the destiny of his clan for generations, was finally irrevocably free. They performed his funeral rites with the solemn majesty due a king and a god. When Yudhishthira returned to Sterlington, he was a transformed man. The suffocating weight of his guilt had been lifted, replaced by the sober, pragmatic, and compassionate clarity of his grandfather's teachings. He was no longer a reluctant victor mourning the butcher's bill of his crown. He was the emperor. His purpose was now a sharp, unyielding blade, his heart steeled for the long, agonizing labor of stitching together a broken world. Armed with the wisdom gleaned from the bed of arrows, Yudhishthira finally embraced his role. For 36 long, prosperous years, he and his brothers governed the kingdom of Hastinapura. Their reign was like a golden, lingering autumn following the carnage of a hellish summer. The land healed, the harvest was bountiful, and justice became the heartbeat of the realm. They performed the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, to consecrate the rule of law and to wash the final, lingering stains of kinship slaying from their souls. A new generation rose to adulthood, led by the young Parikshit, the son of Abhimanyu, the boy whom Chris Kaine had shielded within his mother's womb. He was now a handsome, capable heir, a beacon of hope for the future. It seemed that a permanent peace had been won, bought with the blood of an entire era. But in the distant, salt-sprayed kingdom of Dvarka, the clock was ticking on a 36-year-old curse. Gwen Sterling's terrible prophecy was nearing its fruition. The Yadava clan, Chris Kaine's own kin, had grown bloated on the marrow of peace, their virtue curdling into the sour wine of arrogance. Their strength had devolved into a drunken, bellicose pride. In a fit of mindless mockery, a group of young Yadava princes disguised one of their own as a pregnant woman and approached a party of visiting sages, demanding that the holy men predict the gender of the unborn child. The sages, their vision piercing through the flimsy veil of deception, were consumed by a righteous, apocalyptic fury. "Since you seek to mock the divine," they cursed, their voices echoing like thunder, "the boy you have birthed will bring forth an iron club that shall annihilate your entire race down to the last man." The prophecy manifested with terrifying precision. The terrified Yadavas ground the resulting iron club into a fine, obsidian-like powder and cast it into the churning sea. But the tide, as if in league with fate, washed the dust back upon the shore, where it sprouted into a forest of reeds as hard and razor-sharp as Damascus steel. Fate took one final, cruel turn. A single triangular shard of the club was swallowed by a fish. The fish was caught, and the shard was discovered by a hunter named Jara, who forged it into the tip of a perfect, lethal arrow. Years later, during a riotous festival by the sea, the intoxicated Yadava warriors turned upon one another. A petty argument flared into a brawl, and the brawl metastasized into a full-blown civil war. Driven by a fratricidal frenzy, they grabbed the enchanted reeds growing on the shore and slaughtered one another until the entire clan was reduced to silence and dust. Chris Kaine's elder brother, Balrama, seeing that the end had arrived, sat in a state of deep, oceanic meditation. His soul departed his body, manifesting as a great white serpent that returned to the eternal cosmic waters. Chris Kaine, his purpose on earth fulfilled and his family consumed by the fire of their own pride, walked alone into the quiet solitude of the forest. He sat at the base of a tree, his left foot resting upon his right knee in a perfect yogic posture. It was there that the hunter Jara, spotting the flash of color and mistaking the sole of the god's foot for the ear of a deer, released his bowstring. The arrow, tipped with the final, cursed fragment of iron, pierced Chris Kaine's heel, his one mortal vulnerability. With a gentle, knowing smile, Chris Kaine forgave the trembling, horrified hunter. "Do not fear," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of leaves. "All is as it was written in the stars." Then, the eighth avatar of Vishnu, the divine charioteer, the friend and shepherd of the Pandavas, released his spirit from its mortal shell. With Chris Kaine's departure, the great cosmic clock shifted its gears. The Dvapara Yuga, the Bronze Age of heroes and demigods, had reached its sunset. The Kali Yuga, the present age of darkness, discord, and spiritual decay, had dawned. When word of the Yadava's annihilation and the death of Chris Kaine reached the aging Pandavas in Sterlington, they understood that their season had ended. Their guiding star was extinguished, their world had folded into history, and this new, colder age had no place for them. Yudhishthira summoned the young Parikshit and, in a ceremony of quiet dignity, abdicated his throne, anointing his grandnephew as the new sovereign. Then, for the final time, the five brothers and their wife Draupadi cast off their royal silks and golden ornaments. Clad in the simple, rough-hewn bark cloth of renunciance, they turned their backs on the capital, their kingdom, and the world of men. They began their final pilgrimage, the Mahaprasthana, the Great Departure. They marched north, toward the mighty, snow-veiled Himalayas, long whispered to be the stairway to the heavens. As they left the city, a stray dog, thin, wiry, and loyal, quietly fell into their wake, becoming their last silent companion. As they ascended into the thin, sacred air of the mountains, their mortal bodies, heavy with the minor sins and persistent attachments of their long, blood-stained lives, began to fail. The first to collapse was Draupadi. As she stumbled and lay dying on the frozen earth, Bhima turned to Yudhishthira in anguish. "Why does she, the most virtuous among us, fall first?" he demanded. Yudhishthira, walking forward without glancing back, replied, "For all her devotion to us, her heart held a secret, lingering partiality for Arthur Sterling." Next to fall was the wise Samuel Sterling, undone by the quiet, creeping sin of pride in his own intellect. Then fell the handsome Nicholas Sterling, claimed by his vanity and the adoration of his own reflection. Then fell the greatest hero of them all, Arthur Sterling, brought down by the warrior's hubris, the memory of a boast once made, that he could annihilate all his enemies in a single day. Finally, the mighty Benjamin Sterling, his colossal strength failing him, fell under the weight of his gluttony and his brutal, unthinking violence. Only Yudhishthira, the king of justice, remained, with the faithful dog still trotting silently at his heels. He reached the summit of the world, the gate to the heavens. The god Indra appeared, descending in a radiant celestial chariot. "Ascend, great king," Indra commanded. "You alone have earned the right to enter the abode of the gods in your mortal form." Yudhishthira bowed, but as he moved to step into the chariot, he gestured toward the mangy dog. "This creature has been my constant, loyal companion," he said. "He must accompany me." Indra laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "There is no place for beasts in heaven. Abandon him and claim your immortal reward." But Yudhishthira refused. He would not, he declared, forsake a creature that had shown him such pure devotion, not even for the gates of paradise. To betray a loyal friend, he argued, was a sin so profound that he would rather walk the path of the damned than commit it. As the words left his lips, the dog shimmered and dissolved. Standing before him was the god Dharma, his own divine father. It had been the final test of his character. Yudhishthira ascended into the celestial realm, but there he found not his brothers, but his cousin, Donovan Sterling, enthroned in glory among the heroes. An angel explained that Donovan had earned his seat by dying the honorable death of a warrior. When Yudhishthira demanded to see his own family, he was led into a dark, foul-smelling pit, a vision of hell where his brothers and Draupadi were being tormented for their past failings. His heart breaking, he dismissed the angel. "I shall stay here," he declared, "with the people I love. I would rather endure the torments of hell in their company than enjoy the splendors of heaven alone." This final, ultimate act of selfless loyalty was his last penance. The moment he chose to remain, the horrific illusion shivered and vanished. Their atonement was complete. He was reunited with his brothers and his wife in the true, tranquil peace of heaven. Their long, sorrowful, and heroic journey had finally reached its end. Thus, the story of the Great War and the generation that fought it concludes. It is a tale of a victory that tasted of ashes, of a righteous path paved with sin, and of the profound, aching duty of living in a world that is constantly passing away. It is the story of the end of an age. And now, as their story fades into the silence of eternity, your own journey into rest begins. The battlefield is quiet. The heroes are finally at peace. All is still. Let the silence cradle you, and let your spirit drift into sleep.